Fold, Splot and Scrunch. One of my favourite ways of doing big pieces of lightweight fabric so quickly and easily, because you can fold a really big piece down to quite a small bit to sit on the table in front of you. It's a technique that's best on medium to lightweight fabrics, so I'm actually doing a piece of bleached calico here, and it'd be about the heaviest that I would do. Say bleached calico, homespun, definitely not calico for this one. It's way too heavy and doesn't allow the water in adequately. I have my piece of white cotton folded down to about 8 thicknesses, but if I were doing something like a silk, I could go through to about 16 thicknesses for that and still know that the colour was going to go right through those layers. I've folded my fabric, and the next step is to wet it. Into the water it goes. If you've got a fair few thicknesses there, it's a good idea to just check that the water has penetrated all those layers. Yes, that's fine. And then we need to squeeze out all the excess water. And if you feel you can't really squeeze very hard, it's okay to just give that fabric a quick blot in a towel. But not necessary if you can give it a really hard squeeze. Okay, now we're ready to colour. I'm just going to choose 3 colours. Let's go magenta, purple and cyan this time. Open the cap by twisting the little bit at the top. Cyan's ready to go. And I'm just going to force the colour through all those layers. Let's just go randomly for this one, but you can put them on in patterns if you wish. Check that it is penetrating all layers. Not quite as good on the reverse, but we'll fix that one up shortly. And we've looked at the fact that with Liquid Radiance, excess is the enemy. If we put too much colour into our fibre, the excess will actually make that fabric stiff and dull, and that's not what we want. So as I'm applying these colours, I'm very aware that I mustn't fill it up totally. I'm going to leave a little bit of my fabric colour showing. Liquid Radiance is unique. Liquid Radiance is a finely milled acrylic, not a dye. If it were a dye and I put excess in there, the excess would come out in the steaming, the rinsing, the processing, the chemical fixatives and all that extra thing, all those extra things that we have to do. So we don't have to worry about that with Liquid Radiance. All we have to think about is not putting excess there in the first place. I think we could do with a little bit more in some of those places. So what I'm now checking for is the fact that I don't want probably any more than about 1 centimetre showing in any of those areas. Okay, let's check the reverse. Definitely needs a touch-up. Here we go. But not applying nearly as much this time as I did from the first side. It really doesn't even matter if you don't put it exactly where the original colours were, because in a moment I'm going to blend those colours. It would matter, however, if you were doing some sort of a pattern at this stage. Okay, the colours are now there. For our next step, we're going to blend those colours, and I'll simply pick up one end of that fabric and roll it, and you can see those colours merging as I roll. I could have put on my rubber gloves, but I know that Liquid Radiance is non-toxic and non-polluting, and I know that my hands will come clean with soap and water and a nail brush. At this point, the more I squish those colours around, the more they're going to blend. So if I still want to keep the colours a little bit distinct, we'll leave it at that. And then just check to see if there is excess in there. Look, there we've got some. So I'll give it a light squeeze, remembering that excess is the enemy, and the enemy makes your fabric stiff and dull. We now have all that on board, and of course it's way too good to waste. So with another piece of damp fabric, I can first up clean my hands with that and mop up the colour that was left over on my board. If I had a really big puddle at that stage, I could squeeze out this excess. That's practically all water. And just keep squeezing and mopping until you have no more excess. Now the good bit here is that you've created two pieces of fabric that would go together in any given project because they're both on the same colour base. I'm going to dry off my board now and lay out the piece of fabric that I've just coloured. Being careful not to get my scarf in it because it was coloured by this method, but I don't want to recolour it. Our colours are all beautifully blended now, and so it's time to lay out the fabric to form the darks and lights in our patterning. And I do that by simply scrunching it up. The third part of the technique, fold and splot, was scrunch. Here we go. As I form the hills and valleys here, I know that what's up off the plastic will go darker, while what's down against the plastic will go lighter. This is just unique to Liquid Radiance. It's just the way it works. So different ways of forming my hills and valleys will form totally different patterns. Up's dark, down's light. If I were to scrunch it up quite small, what's on the top at the surface will go darker, while what's enclosed will be light. But I know that by leaving it fairly open like that, I can get a good overall coverage of colour, and then I simply leave that alone to dry. Something you will need to get used to is the fact that the difference between wet and dry is amazing. If I leave that to dry like that, the end result will be darks and lights, and they will be smooth like the green piece here. If I want the textured look that you see on the other end of that fabric, I need to add salt. Now I have a favourite salt that I love to use, and it's Epsom salts. I call it my goof-proof salt. And I just put it down into a handy little shaker bottle to make it a whole lot easier to dispense. When I apply the salt to my fabric, I'll just do half of this so you can see the difference in the end result. I'm going gently Bentley, knowing that every grain of salt is going to draw colour to it. If I go too heavily, the colour looks at all that salt and says, oh, I don't know where to go, and it sort of gives up. So you'll get a far more dramatic result by not putting on too much. The salt needs to go on while the fabric is wet enough for the salt to work, but not so wet that it will drown. We don't have to worry about drowning because we mopped up the excess onto our separate piece of fabric. Watching it work is about as exciting as watching your kettle boil. So at this point we just leave it alone until it's dry. Interesting to note that different salts will give you different markings, and we can work with sugars too. With my mop-up piece, let's just lay that out and see what happens. It too will have changed dramatically between wet and dry. Now we've got some beautifully salted fabrics. The salt has done its work, the fabric is dry, and it's time to take the salt off. And from here on, even though the physical salt has been removed, we still need to rinse that fabric to remove any remaining saltiness from where the salt has been sitting. For large pieces of lightweight fabric, fold, spot and scrunch is definitely a quick and easy method and a beautifully effective way to go. We're simply going to fold the fabric dry, wet it thoroughly and squeeze out the excess water, apply the colour from the first side and flip it over and touch up from the back. Really important then to roll it up and squeeze out any excess colour. To blend the colours, we'll roll up the fabric. Then it's really important to squeeze out the excess, which we can mop up onto another piece and cover that at the same time. The scrunching is going to be done to form the pattern, remembering that up will go dark and down will go light, and then you can salt that fabric or add sugar instead of to get different designs. With the colours that we have mopped up from our main piece of fabric, we are of course creating colours that go perfectly with the original piece because they are built on the same colour base. You can scrunch them, you can lay them flat according to just whatever you want. So let's look at some different scrunches, some different colours, some different salts, some left laying flat, some scrunched in hills and valleys lengthwise. It's totally up to you as to how you want your fabrics to look. Table salt looks wonderful on really fine fabrics too. When you're working with the three primary colours, it's very easy to get them a bit murky, but look what the addition of salt will give to those fabrics. And even the mop-ups from those, which can be very grey, look wonderful when they're scrunched.